on the YouTube, do I need to be on the call too?
No.
Okay.
Is that, okay, so this is the info session for the affordable units at Medfield Meadows. And my name is David Cashman. I work at SEB Housing. We are going to be doing this information session. Sorry, just put the phone on here too. We're going to be doing this information session both via a conference call and via the YouTube live stream. I think we're just at about 6 o'clock, which is when we're supposed to start. I'm going to give it just another minute to see if anyone else joins in, and then we'll get started. Just for the folks who are on the live stream, could someone just confirm that you can hear me okay? You can hear me? And oh, okay. Someone who's on the live stream, could you just type something into that dialog box to the right of the screen where you see me, just to confirm that you can hear me? I'm not seeing, oh, William. Great, thanks, William, appreciate it. Okay, so we'll get started in just a minute here. So folks, this info session, I'm going to go through the, if you've been on our website or hopefully you have already, you have seen the information packet and the application. I'm going to just go through some of what I think are the most salient points from the information packet to point out. But this information session is for all of your benefits. So if at any time you have a question, please feel free to let me know and I'll be happy to address it. And again, if you are attending via the YouTube live stream, please just type into the dialog box below where Mr. Bento just said we can. If you type below where you see me, that's like a comment section and I won't be able to see that. So just make sure you type to the right of the screen where you see me. All right, so we'll get started. So this is the information session for the 6 affordable units at Medfield Meadows in Medfield. Just to be clear, this is an affordable housing program, and affordable housing means different things to different people. But in this program, essentially what it means is that rents are going to be offered at a level that is lower than what they would be on the market rate side to applicants who qualify. And there are a number of parameters that determine whether or not you qualify for this program. Probably the most salient of which is that you have income that's below the maximums that the program allows. So for households who qualify, you will be able to move forward in the next steps, and we'll talk about what those are, with the ultimate result that if you are able to reserve and rent a unit at Medfield Meadows, you would be getting a unit at rents that are considerably less than what they are on the market rate. I don't know actually exactly what that number is, but it may be close to 1.5 or even 2 or 2.5 times what the rents are in the affordable program. Just so you know, if you don't know already, this is overall a 24-unit development. Some of the units are rental, but there is also a home ownership piece that is being marketed through a separate marketing and application period that we hope will start within the next several months. The affordable home ownership units will be coming online a little bit later than the rental units. Last I was informed by the development team, the rental units were expected to start being ready this summer. Just a quick point of clarification too. We SEB Housing are the affordable housing lottery consultant. We put on the marketing campaign. We interact with all the applicants. We put out the application, produce the informational materials. ultimately screen applicants to determine whether or not they're eligible for this program. For all households who are eligible, we will ultimately run a lottery. The lottery will determine the order that households will get to move forward in selecting units, but we are not the leasing office. So after the lottery, we would be handing off lottery households to the leasing office, and at that point, those households would engage in what's essentially sort of a standard routine insofar as leases go, where you apply for a lease and they run you for probably credit and criminal to see if you're lease eligible, and if you are, then you would move forward in signing a lease. But just to be clear, we are an offsite consultant who is hired by the management team, but we are not the owners, and we are not the ultimately the leasing office who would be interacting with applicants on a day-to-day basis and when they move in. Okay, so this opportunity, as you probably know, is for 6 affordable rental units. There's 1 1-bedroom, 4 2-bedrooms, and 1 3-bedroom being made available through this opportunity. The 1-bedroom is going to be rented at $1,660 per month. The 4 2-bedrooms are made available at $1,825 per month. And the 1 3-bedroom is at $2,002 per month. Please note, those rents do not include utilities. So on top of that, tenants are expected to be able to pay for their heating, their hot water heating, gas cooking, electricity, water, and sewer. So the ultimate monthly costs of living in one of these units is going to be obviously higher when you factor in those utilities on top of those base rents. Those rents are not tied to your specific financial picture. There are affordable programs in this country, in this state, that are premised on such a model. This is not one of those programs. Those rents are tied to area median incomes, which are numbers that the HUD, the federal agency, puts out once a year. And so they're based on assumptions about what quote unquote average households make in a year. And these rents, more specifically, are premised on the idea that they should be affordable to people who are making no more than 80% of the area median income. And that's broken down by household size. So just to give you an example, HUD might say, just for easy numbers, these aren't the real numbers, HUD might say that a 3-person household in this area on average makes $100,000. So in this program, a 3-person household would not be able to make more than $80,000 based on that hypothetical. Again, those are not the real numbers. The real numbers you can find in the information packet, and we'll go over that. But in this hypothetical, if the average 3-person household in this area, according to HUD, made $100,000, this program would say, okay, to qualify as a 3-person household, you can't make more than $80,000, and then these rents should not, you should not be spending more than 30% of your gross income on rent. So that's just a kind of quick background. If you're wondering where do these rents come from, that's the basic formula. But the important thing to remember, and this comes up a lot of times, people wonder, well, do these change based on my financial picture? If my income goes up, my income goes down. These rents do not change based on your own individualized situation. So what are the eligibility requirements to be eligible for this program? Well, the first is that you have to have income and assets that qualify within the program. You have to be under certain income limits. Assets for home ownership are actually, there's a hard line you can't be over. For rental, which is what you're now tuning into, that's what this opportunity is that we're discussing. For rental, there is no asset limit, with the caveat that actual income that's attributable to your assets would be added to your income. So, for example, if you have an asset that yields great interest every year, that interest income could be added or would be added to your income in then making a determination about whether your income satisfies the program requirements. I would say most people, the vast majority of people applying, do not have such a significant amount of income being generated from an asset that this becomes an issue. I suppose that if your income is right up at the threshold of what's allowed, then the income from your assets could bump you over. But I would say in most cases, it is not an issue for most people. This isn't so much a program eligibility, but it is a requirement, but it is something that we have to factor in as we run a lottery and establish priority. But this program, and this will come up later in this discussion when we talk about the lottery and how that's going to work, this program does put an emphasis and a priority for households who are bigger and need all of the bedrooms in the particular unit that they're applying for. And this is applicable really only to the 2 bedrooms and the 3 bedrooms, because every household needs at least 1 bedroom. Some households, according to the program, would say, well, this household really needs 2 bedrooms, whereas a smaller household, according to the program, might say, well, a 1-person household doesn't really need 2 bedrooms. So we'll discuss this more in depth later, but there is priority for households who, according to the program, need all of the bedrooms in the unit. If you own a home, you can't own a home at the time you move in. So if there's anyone tuning in who owns a home, you would need to sell that home before you are allowed to move into a unit. And finally, if you have any sort of financial interest in this development, if you're related to the development team or the management team, that would, for better or worse, disqualify you from being eligible. I should add a note, too, that I had just mentioned that there are 6 units, and I told you that the breakdown was 1 1-bedroom, 4 2-bedrooms, and 1 3-bedroom. Of those 6 units, 1 of the 2 bedrooms is built out for persons with mobility impairments. So if that applies to you, you're in a wheelchair or have some other mobility impairments, when you're filling out your application, you should absolutely answer that question in the affirmative, that there is a question on the application that asks that. Make sure you indicate if that applies to you and if you're interested in a unit that has those accessibility features, because that will give you priority over other households who do not. I would say as well that when you're filling out your program application, it's going to ask you what unit size you're applying for, and you should answer by circling any unit sizes that appeal to you, even if it's more than 1. There is absolutely no downside to selecting more units if you think that you have any interest. But if you do not select a certain unit size and then later decide, you change your mind, we can't then go back and make that change for the lottery. There could be another way to do it, but you'd have to reapply. So I would really encourage you, if you think there's any chance that you might be interested in more than 1, just select them all, because there's no downside to selecting more than 1. And in fact, you could select 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom. And we will let you know if you may not qualify for one of them. But the point is, it is better from your perspective to be over-inclusive than it is to be under-inclusive. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later when I talk about the lottery and the waiting list. But suffice to say that you can select multiple units and be given the opportunity ultimately to move forward on more than 1 track. So you might be able to move forward with, if you selected 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom on your application, It's possible, depending on how many people apply for this lottery and where you're drawn in the lottery results and some other things, it's possible that you could have the opportunity ultimately for 1 bedroom and 2 bedroom. So again, take home is be over inclusive. Another thing is, this is a no documentation lottery. Many of the lotteries that we run, in order for us to qualify you to enter you into the lottery, you have to give us a lot of the supporting income and asset documentation that backs up what you state, your income is and what your job is and taxes and many of these documents. That's not required for this lottery, which actually makes it quite a bit easier to get included in the lottery because you don't have to do all of that work in collecting all of that documentation yet. Eventually, if you move forward, you would be. But given that, it should make filling out the application quite a bit easier, less time intensive. And so if you think you're interested, I really encourage you to apply later on. If you're able to move forward, that's when we would ask for that documentation. But at that point, you're going to have a much better sense if a unit is in fact going to be available to you, and that may be enough to really make submitting all that documentation feel really worth it, because there is that very clear light at the end of the tunnel that you are pretty well assured that you're going to have a unit at that point. But right now, we don't need that documentation. So if you think you're interested, I don't believe filling out the application should take too much time. So fill it out to the best of your ability and make sure you get it in before the deadline so that we can get you into the lottery if you're interested. We talked a couple minutes ago about what the eligibility requirements are for this program. And the first one I mentioned is you have to have income that satisfies or is below what's allowed in this program. The program sets income limits that are tied to the number of people in your household. So in the year, so for this year, 2020, a household size of 1 can make up to $67,400. A household size of 2 can make up to $77,000. Household size of 3 can make up to $86,650. Household size of 4 can make up to $96,250. A household size of 5 can make up to $103,950, and a household size of 6 can make up to $111,650. Those are numbers that are published by HUD each year, and I talked about that earlier too when I talked about 80% of the area median income. These are the actual numbers. Before I was giving hypotheticals, but those numbers that I just quoted you are the actual numbers published by HUD, and those are the numbers that are used to determine both program eligibility and what the rents are for these units. So just as an example here, according to HUD, a family, a household size of 3, making 80% of the area median income, is making $86,650. When you're filling out your application, what is income and who's included? Well, everyone's included who's going to be on the lease or living in the unit. So when you're filling out the application, filling out that chart and listing what your income is, you are responding for yourself and for anyone else who is going to be moving in with you and on the lease. Please think about this carefully as you do it, because you can't alter this once we've run the lottery. And this happens sometimes. Someone applies, they say it's going to be, myself and this other person. That's who they put on the application. That's who submits all of the paperwork for for those lotteries. And then after the lottery, they're getting to move forward and they say, and I want to add this other person too. Is that okay? And unfortunately, according to the program, no, you can't do that. So please, if you are applying, be very thoughtful about who is going to be, who you want to be living in the unit with you, because it's not, you can't change it after the lottery. Now, that being said, once you're if and when you are in a unit, if there are changes in household, you lose a member, you add a member, those are things that can be worked on, and you might have to reapply or requalify, I should say. So it's not as though when I say that you can't change it after the lottery, it's not as if to say that if you apply with Tom and Wilma, then forevermore only Tom and Wilma can be in that unit. There could be changes, but it is to say that if Tom and Wilma are on the application, they're the ones that are in the lottery. They get a position on a waiting list, and then they're at some point moving forward and wanting to lease a unit. Tom and Wilma can't now come back and say, and now we want to add Becky. You can't do that at that point. So please be thoughtful when you're filling out your application about who's going to be living there. As far as those HUD numbers, just a quick point. I said those are numbers that HUD puts out. HUD puts those out every year. So in 2021, those will change. They'll change again in 2022 and every year after that. Usually they go up. Sometimes they go down. And quite frankly, next year, I would not be surprised if they go down. Now, that being said, if you are able to reserve a unit through this opportunity, you can maintain eligibility for the program even with a significant increase in your income. And we'll talk more about that later. But people sometimes or often wonder, if a household size of 1 is only allowed to make $67,400, is that sort of the number, or whatever that number is in 2021 and 2022, is that the number that applies? And the answer is no. There are different income limits for new applicants and for current tenants. And for current tenants, those numbers go up quite a bit more. And I'll give you an example later of what those are. But it builds in some opportunity for households who initially qualify for this program and who move in, who then maybe later, they're fortunate and things are going well at work and they get a raise. Well, that's not necessarily going to disqualify you. Another thing I want to say quickly is that of these 6 units, these have all been approved by the town and by the state. And they've been approved so that they're equitable and fair and provide a proper representation within the development as a whole. So these units will not be readily distinguishable from the exterior to someone who, for example, would just be passing by and looking at the front doors. It's not as if someone can say that's a market rate unit, that's affordable unit, that's a market rate affordable. That is not the case. Similarly, the affordable units are spread out. There are actually a number of buildings in this development. There are, I think 4 of the buildings are buildings that have rental units, and 4 of the buildings are buildings that have homeownership units. But within the rental unit buildings, there are 3 affordable units in one of the buildings, 2 affordable units in another building, and 1 affordable unit in another building. So they're spread across the different buildings. They're not all tucked in one corner or stacked together, otherwise kind of the least desirable units. They are equitable, fair. They are permanently affordable, and the locations of those units have been approved by the state and by the town. Again, we don't need to talk a whole lot about assets. Technically there is an asset requirement, and we do have to ask a lot of questions about what your assets are, mostly with an eye towards looking at the income that is attributable to those assets to then be added to your income picture. But again, there is no asset limit. So even if you have a decent amount of money in a checking account or a savings account or a trust or something like that, again, unless you're really close to the income limit based on your income, or you're generating huge quantities of money from that asset, which most people aren't who apply for this program, the assets are probably not going to be super relevant to your eligibility determination. Nevertheless, the program does require that applicants provide a healthy amount of asset documentation. But again, this is a no income or asset documentation lottery. So you're not going to have to produce, your bank statements and your checking account and a trust or other assets, a certificate of deposit or whatever it may be. You're not going to have to produce that stuff until later on after the lottery. There are no minimum incomes technically in this program. However, households are required by the leasing office to be able to support, and the program, to be able to support the rent on their own. And you can't have a guarantor. So we will, as part of the review that we do for the lottery, look at what you say your income and assets are. And we'll look at it from what we just talked about to make sure that you don't make too much, that you're under this sort of ceiling, which I'm representing sort of not that well by my hand, that you don't make too much, that you're under this program limit. But we'll also look at this floor, which is not a program limit, but it's are you going to have enough money? Do you have enough in income combined with your assets to afford the rent on your own? Because you can't have a guarantor. You can't have someone else who says, I'm going to make sure that, I understand that Joe doesn't have a ton of money, but I'll guarantee that, that the rent is covered each month. That's not permitted in this program. So the leasing office for all of its tenants, both affordable and market rate, requires that they make 2.5 times the rent in income. Again, looking at assets too, to ensure that they'll be able to cover the rent. And so when we analyze your application, we will be looking at sort of a minimum threshold as well. And if you are, clearly below that, we will let you know that you're not eligible for that reason. And again, the point of that is, even though you technically be program eligible, someone who makes $10,000 doesn't have a housing subsidy would be program eligible because they're way under the program income limits, but they'd never be qualified to rent a unit by the leasing office because if you're making $10,000, that's not enough to demonstrate that you're going to be able to support the rents on your own each month. And so you'd never pass lease screening criteria. So it'd really be a disservice to you and everyone involved to have you moving along through this process knowing full well that at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to reserve a unit. Now, if you have a Section 8 voucher or some other kind of housing subsidy, disregard what I've said because this program, you can absolutely use your voucher, provided that the requirements of your voucher issuing authority are met. Usually one of the big ones is making sure that the rents are within what the housing authority is willing to pay. So if you're someone who has a voucher, it may be in your interest to, show them what those rents are and say, hey, is this something that's within what you're willing to pay? Because if not, it may ultimately not work out for that reason, and you don't want to sort of maybe spend all this time if they're just ultimately going to tell you that it's not going to work out. But anyway, the sort of point is we will not be performing a minimum income analysis for households who have a voucher. It's only for households who don't that we will look to see if you have enough money in income and assets to support the rent. For a one-bedroom unit, that translates to $49,800. For a two-bedroom unit, $54,750. And for a three-bedroom unit, that's $60,060. And again, because this isn't a program requirement, it's really just to make sure that we're not moving people along who are ultimately going to be denied by the leasing office. We're not going to scrutinize this determination as closely as we would someone who's right up at that ceiling of the program income limit. That one we really have to look at closely and apply kind of strictly. If you're within the ballpark on these minimum income and assets, we'll say okay, and that's something that you can address with the leasing office later on. So that's just something to keep in mind. So again, I just said, for a one-bedroom unit, technically based on that rent and the formula that you have to make 2.5 times the rent to be able to qualify for a lease, that would be $49,800. If you tell us that you make $47,800, we're probably going to say that's close enough, and we're not going to screen you out for that reason because you are program eligible. You may not be lease eligible, but we don't want to make that determination because you're pretty close. So that's something you'd work out with the leasing office later on. But again, just something to keep in mind. Income is generally a projection of what you're going to make over the next 12 months, which factors in what you've made recently, obviously, because what someone's going to make over the next 12 months is in many ways an imperfect science. It's a projection, but obviously a very good indicator of what you're likely to make in the next 12 months is what you've been making in recent months. So we will look at things like your tax returns and recent pay stubs. It is a rather inclusive calculation, and that's because that's what the program requires. So again, this isn't, I guess, as relevant now as it will be later on when you have to produce all the income and asset documentation. But when you are reporting it now on your application, it may behoove you to look at, to look at page 5 of the information packet, which talks a little bit about how income is calculated and what's included, and to really look closely at all the different sources of income that we list in the income table in the application. And that's meant for your benefit. So I know at first glance that income table can look a little bit unapproachable because there are a lot of boxes. Many of them may not apply to you, and you can just write not applicable and move on. Child support alimony. Well, technically, if you get child support alimony, that is income according to this program. But if that doesn't apply to you, that's a really quick one to just check not applicable and move on. Similarly, if you get Social Security income, well, that's income according to the program. So you would have to include that, and we would have to, look at your statement to see, what you're receiving. But again, that may not apply to many of you, and you can just write not applicable and skip on. If you have a pension, same thing. Retirement distributions, workman's compensation. These are all different sources of income that a lot of people don't think about when we think about just kind of the standard sources of income, which is how much do I get paid in my job? What's my salary, my wages? But again, this is a very sort of all-encompassing income determination, and that's what the program requires. So we, SEB Housing, are not making these rules. We're simply following what the program says we have to look at when we're determining income. So again, I guess the point is there, when you're filling out the application on page 6, you're going to come across the income table. And it's 2 pages long. I totally understand that it can look a little bit, to some people, it may look a little bit overwhelming when they first look at it, but I would imagine a number of things on there may not be applicable to you, so you can just check not applicable and move on. But if it is applicable, understand that that's because, that's a type of revenue source that the program says is income. And so if it applies to you, you need to indicate how much it is that you receive from that source. Some people ask the question, this is something that comes up with some frequency, if you have money in a 401k or retirement account, does that count? It does, even though you can't. Sorry, I've just sort of switched out over to assets here without much of a segue. I apologize for that. But so let me just do that now. So that's income. Well, there's also an asset table. That is 1 page. Again, a number of these things may have absolutely no relevance to you. And if that's the case, you can just write not applicable and move on. So if you don't own, if you don't have money in a mutual fund or stocks and bonds or certificate of deposit, if those things don't apply to you, you just check not applicable and move on. But there are obviously a number of other asset sources that people own other than just what's in their checking and savings account. And we've listed a number of the ones that apply. So please, when you are filling out the asset table, look through them carefully to make sure that you're accounting for all of them. And again, maybe one of the biggies is real estate. If you own real property, you have to have sold that before being able to rent a unit. One of the assets that does sometimes come up that people have questions about is if you have money in a 401k or retirement account, does that count? It does. You have to include the net cash value, even though you may not be intending to touch it for some period of time. That doesn't mean technically you can't. You could. There might be a big penalty, but you could. So that you would have to list what the net cash value would be of liquidating that money now. But again, there's no asset limit, so there's no reason to try and sort of not state what that is, because chances are it ain't going to hurt your chances of being eligible. We talked a little bit, so that's income and assets. That's sort of the first, one of the biggest program eligibility requirements. We also talked a little bit towards the beginning about how the program gives priority to households who, according to program rules, need all of the bedrooms in a unit. This is really applicable to the 2 and 3 bedrooms, because for 1 bedrooms, everyone gets equal priority. But if you have access right now, or if you want to just jot it down, on page 7 of the information packet, we break down the different household types. And those can be broken down into household type 1, household type 2, and household type 3. On one of the very first pages, page 3 of your application, it's going to ask you the same question, and then it's going to refer you to the information packet if you need further instructions about what to fill out. But on your application, you're going to have to indicate the household type that you are. Those types correspond to the need for a bedroom of a particular size. So for example, a household type 3, according to the program, is a household who needs 3 bedrooms, and they could also want less than 3 bedrooms, but they need 3 bedrooms, perhaps because they have 5 people in the household. There are other type 3 households, that's one of them. If there are 5 people or 6 people in your household, according to the program, you need 3 bedrooms. A household type 2 may want a 3-bedroom and can apply for a 3-bedroom, but does not have priority for a 3-bedroom because only type 3 households have priority for a 3-bedroom. So as between a type 3 household and a type 2 household, when we get into the lottery, and we'll get there in a little bit, every type 3 household who applies for a 3-bedroom is going to have priority over every type 2 household who applies for a 3-bedroom. But a type 2 household would have equal priority for a 2-bedroom, because just like a type 3 household, a type 2 household needs 2 bedrooms. And then there are type 1 households who, according to the program, only need 1 bedroom. So these are fleshed out in the information packet on page 7 if you're not quite sure when you're filling out the application what household type you are. But it's important that you take time and you understand that, because that will ultimately have some bearing, or may have some bearing, on how you get placed on the lottery results list, which influences your priority and the order in which you may get to move forward. So you want to be careful, especially if you are a type 2 or type 3, that you don't shortchange yourself and say you're a type 1 when in fact you're a type 2. But also, if you say you're a type 3 and then later on it becomes clear you're a type 2, and vis-a-vis you claiming improperly that you're a type 3 household, that will also be something that will have to be remediated after the lottery. So I guess the point is, read page 7 of the information packet when you're filling out that question on the application. If it's still not clear to you, call us. We'll be happy to talk you through it. But you do want to get your household type correct, and it shouldn't be that hard. But I do recognize, in some cases there could be some slight oddities that may raise questions for folks. So if you fall into that category, give us a call, shoot us an email, and be happy to tell you what the correct selection for you is. But just as a kind of quick aside, I do recognize we're about 40 minutes in here, and I haven't seen anyone with a question yet, which is totally fine. If you don't have a question and this is going along fine, that's great. I can just kind of keep going. But if you're kind of holding off because you don't want to jump in, please don't worry. Go ahead and type your question in. I'll kind of take a pause to address it. If you prefer to wait till I get through and then ask questions at the end, that's totally fine as well. I will, if there's anyone who's going through a separation or divorce, I recognize that may not apply to folks tuning in, but if you are, there is a section on that in the information packet about how you have to have begun the process. If you're just contemplating it, we'd have to include your current spouse in the income and asset determination. So if that applies to you, keep that in mind. So let me kind of transition gears here now to some of the kind of timing and maybe getting into more of the lottery. So that step 1, I guess, is if you're interested, fill out an application and get it into us before June 15th, which is the deadline. We will then we'll actually assess it within a couple of days of you submitting it. So if you submit an application to us this week, you can expect to hear back within 2 or 3 or 4 days with an answer about, are you eligible? Are you ineligible? Are you incomplete? I don't imagine there'll be many incomplete households in this lottery because you don't have to submit documentation. It could happen. Maybe you don't answer a question. But most households will just be getting a yes, you're eligible, or no, you're not eligible. And here are the units you're eligible for. And here's your household type. When you submit an application, and if you're eligible, you will get a letter from us, and it will have a lottery number. And that number will be in the form of A.XXX. So maybe it's A.001. That number is merely an anonymous identifier to be used in the lottery. It has no bearing on sort of where you are moving forward. It is just a way of keeping your information anonymous when we do the lottery. If you are approaching June 25th, when the lottery is going to take place, and you think you're in the lottery, but you don't know your application number, alarms should be going off that you need to get in touch with us and ask us what's happening, because every household in the lottery needs to have a lottery application number. It happens very infrequently, but I have seen households show up for the lottery excited, wanting to see where they're going to get drawn, only for us to tell them that they don't have an application number, and they said, oh, I didn't realize I was supposed to, or something like that. But point is, if you think you're in the lottery, you're going to have the lottery application number. If you don't know it on the night of the lottery, that's okay. We can figure that out. But if you do know it, great. The lottery will be on June 25th. Barbara, yes, you may. You just need to have sold it before you move in. So you don't have to have sold it when you apply. But if you want to list what you expect your equity in the home, what you kind of anticipate selling it for, and what you anticipate retaining once you've paid off the bank, if there is still a mortgage. But you don't need to have sold it before the lottery. You just need to have sold it before you move in. So In your case, we will give you a conditional, assuming you're otherwise eligible, Barbara, we will give you a conditional lottery number that will indicate that your house has to be sold before you're allowed to lease a unit. Kate, you have to have closed on the house before you sign a lease. So again, you cannot have the house in your name at the time that you sign a lease. And those are kind of timing details that can be worked out with the leasing office later on. So the next question plays into that, Barbara, along with Kate's, which is, what is the move-in date? Well, the move-in date is something you're going to set with the leasing office. We don't know it yet. As last I was told, units would be ready in June. I don't know that they're all ready at exactly the same time. They may be staggered a little bit. And when we do, so kind of jumping ahead here, but when we run the lottery, we'll create waiting lists. The waiting list will determine the order that households get to move forward. When households get to move forward, they'll get to choose from any of the available units. So Barbara and Kate, it's possible, and I'm going to go through the lottery in a second, the waiting list and how that plays out, so I may end up sort of repeating some of this, but it's possible that you may end up having the option to select a unit that may not be ready, may not be the first one that's going to be ready after the lottery, because you are trying to sell a home and you want a unit that's coming online a little bit later, so that you have some time to sell the house. So I can't give you a firm move-in date because I don't know the precise date that all 6 units will be ready. And also, I recognize that that's really sort of a negotiation, just as it is on the market rate side with the leasing office. The leasing office may expect that within, a certain number of days of being fully eligible that you're going to be able to move in. It's not going to be 10 days. That's not enough time, but it might be a month. It might be a month and a half. I don't know exactly what their policy is going to be. So that is something that, you'll be able to work out with them. It'll be a function of the specific unit you are able to choose, when that unit's ready, and most likely when you're fully program eligible and how much time they'll give you to move in. So there's kind of a number of moving parts, but related to that is the fact that you're going to kind of have a better sense once the lottery is run, because the lottery will determine the waiting list. So right there, you'll know, am I number 1 on the waiting list? Am I the first person moving forward? Or am I number 10 and I have to wait for all these households ahead of me before I'm going to get invited? Additionally, you still need to, after the lottery, you need to do a full certification where you provide us with all your documentation, and that's good. You're going to be given a little bit of time to do that too. So the combination of where you are on the waiting list, getting all the documentation into us, and sort of the amount of time that you have, it'll be 10 days to do that, and then the unit you pick, there could be a number of weeks or months kind of between when the lottery is, when the move-in date is, and that would be time, for you to get the house sold. Do you have to live in the area already? Nope, there's no requirement to live in the area. There is a local preference, which elevates some local households over households who are not local, but that doesn't mean you have to be local to qualify. So these are all questions. Let me just give you a little bit of a picture here that I think will kind of summarize some of those things that I just talked about and add in a couple other things. So you apply for the lottery, get your application in, you'll get an application number. We'll run the lottery on June 25th. We'll put all the application numbers in the box. We're going to have a local preference drawing and a general drawing. every household that applies for the lottery will have a waiting list position. And you could be on several waiting lists depending on whether you apply for several apartments. Oftentimes when people hear lottery, they think of winners and losers, how many people get picked, how many people don't get picked. That is not how these lotteries run. Every household who is eligible for the lottery will get picked, and every household who gets picked will have a position on a waiting list. And those waiting lists will determine the order that households will get to move on to the next step in this process. So the next step after the lottery and after we send you, so the night of the lottery, we'll send you the waiting list, and those will just be from top to bottom with your application number. So you'll know that very same night on June 25th, am I, for example, am I number 1 on the 1-bedroom list, or am I number 10, or am I number 20? And if you're number 20, then that means there are 19 households ahead of you that are going to get to move forward. And if there's only one 1-bedroom, that may mean that you may not get to move forward with a 1-bedroom. But maybe you will. Depends on what happens with the households ahead of you. Once you're on a waiting list, you're on there for good. You don't get taken off as long as you remain interested going forward. So in theory, maybe you're number 20 on the lottery on the 1-bedroom waiting list. You don't get to move forward now. But in a year from now, the household who took the unit has moved on. Every other household has moved on. They're not interested. And your turn could come up again if you're still interested. So we'll send you those results the night of the lottery. The next step will be that for the top households, and we'll probably invite a number. So we may invite up to 5 or 10 households from each list to then move on to the next step, which is to submit all the income and asset documentation that you didn't have to submit to get into the lottery. And you're going to be given a time, there will be a time limit on this, and that's not to be mean, but it's because, the leasing office is going to have these units ready, and they want people who are able to move forward. And it's not fair to them, and it's not fair to the households behind you if you, take 4 months to get all this paperwork in. That's just not manageable. But in order to help facilitate this and to prepare you, if and when you submit an application, you're eligible for the lottery. When we send you your lottery application number, we're also going to send you a documents requirements guide, which is going to tell you in depth what documents that you're going to have to submit for eligibility at this step. So you can begin preparing your file theoretically right now. If you've already applied and you already have an application number, you would have been given this documents requirements guide. You can start collecting this stuff. You can start putting your pay stubs in a file. You can start putting, bank statements, your taxes from last year, whatever other statements are applicable. Start building your file so that stuff's ready, and keep doing that as you get closer, so that if you have a good waiting list position and you get that letter from us that says, congratulations, you're number 2 on the 2-bedroom waiting list after the lottery. We're now inviting you to move forward to submit all the income and asset documentation. Hopefully you've got that file ready to go and you can submit it that same day, or maybe there's 1 or 2 things missing. But if you've done nothing and you're number 2 on the 2-bedroom waiting list, great, hooray, I'm getting invited to move forward and I haven't collected 1 piece of documentation. That's going to be a real hustle. A real hustle to get all that stuff. There's a lot that's required. So I would really stress you to start preparing earlier rather than later. For households who are in the lottery, who get waiting list positions that are higher and get invited to move forward, they submit their documentation to us. That's usually a bit of an iterative process. Most people need to try more than once. There's usually something missing, or you submit something and it raises other questions, and so we need to ask for more documentation. A lot of people have income or deposits that come into their bank account that's not attributable to a job or anything else that shows up on their application. that we need to ask about. Could be something as simple as you went out to dinner with a friend, you paid, and they paid you back on Venmo. And we need, and you did that a couple times, and we see a number of deposits coming into your bank account that clearly aren't from your job. So we have to ask. So that comes up, but among other things. But the point is, if you've done a good job preparing your file, you should be a good, well on your way to having a totally complete file. However, oftentimes what's in your file may also raise other questions. So even if you've got everything that's on the program certification, it may be the case that we have to ask for certain additional documents because we didn't know to ask for them until we saw what you actually submitted. But again, there is a 10-day timeline on this. So you really do want to get the file in a very good position to submit. And that way, if there are those additional questions that we have to ask, now you're just tracking down, 2 statements from a friend or whatever it is saying, oh yeah, I paid Dave back for a dinner, and that explains that, $50 deposit or whatever it is. And that's quick, it's easy, and you're done. But if you're doing that on top of everything else, it's going to be a lot. If you're eligible at that point, and again, we'll work with you. We'll answer questions. There'll be dialogue back and forth. You'll have, if something's incomplete, we'll let you know. If you got to get other documents, you'll have time to go get those. But if you submit everything, we'll make a determination. If you're ineligible, unfortunately, that will be the end of the process for you. If you're eligible, great. We'll let you know that you're eligible, and at that point, the next step in the process will be to apply for a lease. Again, we're not the leasing office. We're the offsite consultant, affordable housing program agent. So we, at that point, would then pass you off to the leasing office, and you would then enter into the rental process with them. We're not screening you for rental eligibility, other than to what I mentioned earlier on, to sort of take a less rigorous look at your income and assets to make sure that you can pass the leasing office's screening criteria in that regard, to make sure you have enough to support the rent. But we're not looking at your credit. We're not looking at, your background, tenant references or landlord references or anything like that. We don't ask those questions. You will not submit any of those documents to us. But the importance is to remember you're dealing with 2 separate entities who are making different determinations. So if you've gotten through the lottery and then you've submitted all your income and asset documentation and we say you're eligible for the program, that's great. You've gotten a lot of the way there. You're close, but you do now still need to move on to the next step, which is to apply with the leasing office and be lease eligible, which is a different determination. So please keep that in mind. It does unfortunately happen that someone may be program eligible, but not lease eligible. Barbara, I see your question on pets, and I'm just looking to see if I have that info. I thought I saw that it was pet friendly, but let me just check here. So I'm on page 13. Barbara, I'm going to have to get back to you on that. The info that I had from the leasing office was dogs are permitted, and I don't know if that was purposefully I don't know if the omission of cats was purposeful or otherwise. So, Barbara, let me just. That's my. Okay, Barbara. So I just gave you and this is for anyone. If you want to get in touch with me after this, if you have a question that's come up. Barbara, can you email me, David at SEB Housing, and I'm going to follow up for you with the leasing office about cats because I just don't see that in the information they provide to us, and so I don't know what the answer is. So, William, you start a new job. So I assume Do you know if you have a salary? Have they indicated what that is going to be? I'm just going to find my place here while I'm waiting for William to answer. William's starting a new job June 1, so assumedly his income is going to change, and I assume that, William, what you've made in the past obviously then is not going to be a good indicator of what you're going to make in the future. But maybe if you have a salary, they've indicated, made an offer and said what the salary is, and in that case, that's what you'd list because that's what you're going to make going forward. And at that point, what you made at an old job or if you weren't working would be much less relevant. So that's what I would put on your application. William, I'll wait for you to respond if you have a further follow-up on that, but just picking up where I left off, you've demonstrated your eligibility with SEB Housing. You've submitted all your income and asset documentation. You've now applied with the leasing office. The leasing office has determined that you're eligible. At that point, you are then going to select from any of the available units on the waiting list that you're on. Some of you may be on more than one waiting list. Maybe you indicated on your application that you were interested in a 1 or 2 bedroom, so you selected both, so you got a position on both waiting lists. So you, at that point, may have to make a determination about which one you're more interested in. But you will be able to pick from any of the units that are available on the waiting list that you've been invited from. And as I said before, those units may not all be ready at exactly the same time. So just as an example, because there's only one 1 bedroom and 1 3 bedroom, but there's 4 2 bedrooms. So this is where this would be relevant, because if you're on the 2 bedroom, they may not all be ready, and so you may say, I actually want the one that's coming on last, or second, or third, or first, whatever works best for you. But you can choose from whatever is available. So William, just looking, so it's an hourly job. You have an idea, but there's no set amount. Yeah, I think, it sounds like there's some uncertainty. I think that you have to indicate what you, so you know what the hourly is, and you would indicate what you are expecting to make based on the number of hours you expect to work, and extrapolate off of that. And then if you're able to if you have a higher waiting list position and you get invited to move forward to that next step where you submit all your income and asset documentation, at that point, you're going to have some paperwork to demonstrate what you've been making, and hopefully it roughly approximates what you put on your application. But I recognize you're dealing with a little bit of uncertainty, and I think at this point you just have to give it an educated guess based on the hourly rate, how many hours you expect to work, and hopefully that will roughly approximate what actually happens for when we if you get to that point of having to submit that documentation. When we do an income and asset review after the lottery, just a point, those reviews are good for 6 months. So if you move in within 6 months of SEB Housing telling you that you're eligible, you're good. If for whatever reason there's some huge delay and it ends up being longer than that, you may have to update your file to make your documents current. I don't know if that'll be applicable. It could be. Sometimes unexpected things happen, but it's just something to keep in mind. I know most households, if it does happen, are usually not thrilled at having to update their file, but hopefully you can understand if we tell you in June of 2020 that you're eligible for the program, and for whatever reason you don't end up moving in until April of 2021, 10 months later, well, things could have changed quite a bit. And the program would say at that point, it's been too long, you have to update some of your documentation. I had mentioned earlier on towards the beginning of this info session that the program builds in a buffer for residents to make more money and still be eligible. I've listed on page 15 of the information packet what those renewal limits are. So just for an example, you can make 140% of the income limit that's applicable to new tenant applicants. So what that means for real numbers is a one-person household applying as a new applicant trying to get into the program would have an income limit of $67,400 that applies to them. Using that same current limit, if that was not an applicant but a tenant who was renewing, because you have to renew each year, they would be able to make up to $94,360. So almost a $30,000 buffer there. So the good news there is that, well, the bad news is, maybe bad news, is you have to recertify each year. So it does require, you know, if you're able to move forward in this process and reserve a unit and move in, you know, 8 months from now, you're going to be getting a letter that says it's time to renew, and you know you have to go through that process, and that does require some work, but it ensures that the you know people who are eligible for the program are living in the units. So ultimately, it's a good thing. You know, it means that someone who's making $300,000 a year isn't occupying an affordable unit, but it does require you to put in that work. The good news is that if you've done well at work or something and you're now making more money, you have a nice buffer there to the tune of almost $30,000 where you would still be eligible. So you don't necessarily have to, you know, reject that raise if that, you know, is something that comes up for you. There is, as I mentioned, there is a local preference that is applied in the lottery that establishes or that influences the waiting list. So that applies to people who live in Medfield, who work in Medfield, who work in or for Medfield, and it includes people with bona fide job offers in Medfield. Even if you're not working there right at this moment, but you know, William, for example, if you're not working in Medfield but your new job is in Medfield, you could say that you qualify for local preference. If you have kids attending the Medfield schools, you qualify for local preference. That's it. You live there, you work there, you have kids attending the schools. Those are the people that qualify for local preference. And if you indicate that in the lottery, you will get that preference when we do the lottery sorting. But after the lottery, if you're invited to move forward, you will have to demonstrate that you did in fact qualify at the time of the lottery, not at the time that you're being assessed, after the lottery. So if right now you don't meet any of those, you live in some other town and you don't, you know, have kids that go to Medfield schools and you don't have a job there, but you're hoping that you might move there in the next month or two. So you say, yeah, I qualify for local preference. And then after the lottery, well, you've already moved there. That's actually not okay. It's at the time you apply. You have to qualify at the time you apply. So please consider that when filling out that question, because that could invalidate your position on a waiting list if it's later determined that you inaccurately claimed local preference at the time you applied. If you're out of state, Barbara, you can apply, but you definitely, well, I would assume you don't qualify for local preference, but you can absolutely apply. I want to say too, sometimes people hear about this local preference and they say, oh, well, is there any point in even applying? Yes, apply, definitely, because, you know, there's still a very good chance that you could move forward. And local preference doesn't trump household size. Again, local preference does not trump household size. So just to give you an example, when we do the waiting list for the 3-bedroom units, remember how I talked about bigger households who need all of the bedrooms in the unit will get priority. What that means is that every household who's a type 3 is going to be above every household who's a type 2, who's going to be above every household who's a type 1 on the waiting list, no matter how they're drawn in the lottery, okay? So that's one of the really kind of anticlimactic things when we do the lottery result drawing, is you don't know exactly what it means when I'm picking the numbers out of the box, because A, you don't know what unit sizes the number that's not yours applied for. You don't know what household type they are. You don't know if they're local preference or not. And so a lot of times you don't know exactly what it means until I actually make the waiting list and send them to you that same night. But what that means is that, for example, if a type 2 household applied for a 3-bedroom unit, let's say there were 5 type 2 households and they are 1 through 5 picked out of the box for the lottery. So I picked, 5 type 2 households, just that's how they get picked. And then I picked 5 type 3 households as spots number 6 through 10. Those 5 type 3 households are going to leapfrog the 5 type 2 households on the 3-bedroom waiting list. Again, on the 3-bedroom waiting list, not the 2-bedroom if they've applied for that, on the 3-bedroom list. Whether local preference or not. Okay, whether local preference or not. So a type 3 household who lives in California and is applying for this will skip a type 2 household who lives in Medfield who's applying for a 3-bedroom unit, no matter how they're drawn in the lottery. So if there was only 2 households, just to kind of take it one step further, if we were to receive precisely 2 applications for a 3-bedroom unit before the lottery, and one of them was a type 3 and one of them was a type 2, I theoretically wouldn't even need to do the drawing for those 2 households, because I already know the type 3 is going to be ahead of the type 2 on the 3-bedroom list before I've even drawn their numbers, because that's what the program requires when we do the sorting. Okay? But anyway, going back to where we started, local preference can give you an advantage relative to households of similar type, depending on the waiting list, but it doesn't trump household type. And again, there is one disabled accessible unit, and I think I mentioned that. If that applies to you, please indicate that on your application, because you would get obviously priority for that unit as against any household who does not meet the features of that unit. There is a question on the application about race. The reason that's asked is because the minority households in the local preference pool have to be equal to or greater than the minority representation in the surrounding area. So sometimes, if I think there are 27% minority in the surrounding area, if there were 4 households who indicated that they qualified for local preference, and only one of them indicated they were a minority, but there were other minorities who applied, but they just weren't local preference, we would have to do an additional drawing to add one more household who's minority into the local pool. You don't need to worry about those sort of percentages or get bogged down in that, but if you're wondering why we asked that question on the application, that's the reason. It can be a mechanism, or depending on how how people respond to that question, we may end up adding a minority to the local preference lottery pool. That's it. That's what I got, folks. If people have questions, I am happy to address them now. I've put my personal email in the thread, so if people have a question that comes up later, and Barbara, please email me again, so I have your email so I can follow up with you about cats. But if anyone, isn't thinking of something right now, but then later they realize they have a question, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to talk to you and try and get your question answered. But again, hopefully this has been, and again, I'll continue to kind of keep this open for a couple minutes here to see if folks have any other questions. But as I'm sort of waiting to see if anything comes in, probably the most important thing I could say is if you think that you are interested in this and you think that you'd like to apply, just submit an application, do it earlier rather than later. It really shouldn't take you that long to submit the application. You'll get a pretty quick response about whether or not you're eligible, and you can start building your file. And by the time you need to submit all the supporting documentation, which is tedious, and we recognize it requires some effort. By the time you're asked to submit it, you're going to know where you are on the waiting list, and you're going to have an idea. Hey, I'm number 2 on the waiting list for a 2-bedroom. There are 4 units. I know I'm going to get an opportunity if I'm eligible. So that really feels incentivizing to get all this paperwork in, because there's a real light at the end of the tunnel here. So that's it. I'm going to be quiet for a second and see if anyone has any questions. And if not, you've got my email, and our contact is on the front page of the application, info@sebhousing.com, info@sebhousing.com. Shoot us an email if you have questions, or give us a call. We can absolutely accept applications that are email scanned and emailed. Go ahead. That's actually the preferable way to get them. If you want to scan it and email it to us, you can fax it to us. You can send it in the snail mail, or you can even show up at our address in Needham. We've got a blue drop box outside. You can just put your application in there, and we will get it. But again, if you have access to a scanner and can scan it in, go ahead and do that. Send it to info@sebhousing.com, and you will hear back from us within a couple of days. I don't see any other questions coming in, and so hopefully you found this informative and helpful. Get your applications in. Thanks for tuning in, and please be in touch if you have any questions. Thanks, everyone, and have a great night. Good night.